Chapter 9 In the Shadow of the Black Wolf, AD 1179, 9th April. Many months went by. Months in which Hector found himself almost exclusively occupied in finding the Black Wolf. First he had come to Lenegar, where he had heard from two frightened men in the local tavern about their friend who had been stabbed to death by a stranger in black armor. When he asked them why, they tremulously said he had killed him just like that. With this information he took his dozen soldiers and continued north. In the village of Blacknut they said he had broken both the man's legs. Here, too, he learned nothing about the motive. Apparently this Black Wolf acted violently at random. One evening, as he sat with his men around the campfire, they had already tied up the horses and were just about to pass the soup bowls around. He remembered his childhood. Back then this man was not called the Black Wolf, monster, demon or one-man army, but clearly he had recognized him by that scar above his left eye. It had to be one and the same man. As a boy he had only stolen bread and other food, but Hector still reproached himself. If only he had been able to bring the boy to justice back then. And although he was a man who loved nature, especially now in spring when everything was coming to life, none of this could really reassure him. In the meantime he had at least managed to try his hands at a few lines of poetry, one of which read, "Once more nature rises from the dead." There was no hope of finding this bastard frozen to death, and since his horse seemed to have healed, he could escape them even more easily. None of their horses could keep up with him, as quickly became apparent after a few chases. And this despite the fact that they had stations here and there, where they could exchange their exhausted animals for some fresh ones. Actually, he had hoped that Thorin would judge him by a stroke of providence. But the Black Wolf still seemed as lively as ever. Perhaps, Hector thought, this was to be a test by his god, a test of his perseverance. After their last hunt had led them past small copes, to Sage Sea, to Federklinge, where one of the soldiers already suspected that the Black Wolf might be trying to escape by ship from Sanctor. One of his men suggested to Hector that perhaps only by setting a trap would it be possible to catch this criminal. They got as far as East Fort and Starbooth, and then the trail ended abruptly. They had lost the Black Wolf. As things stood now, Hector had no choice but to return to Aston to report back to Atreya. He would probably even be brought before Talon himself, for the latter seemed to show a special interest in the case of the Black Wolf. But all was perhaps not yet to be lost. Hector was just beginning to get an idea. A gentle wind brushed through the treetops of the Angelblood birches. Bees buzzed across the meadows and butterflies fluttered from flower to flower. A squirrel was fleeing up a tree from the clearing when it spotted a man in black armor approaching. Cackling, it now perched on a branch, arms around its belly, watching the newcomer. "Should be around here somewhere," the wanderer muttered to himself, giving the hood on his head a nudge from his thumb so that a little more sunlight could fall on his face. "You heard that too, didn't you?" he asked Asa, gently nudging his shoulder with his elbow. The animal only snorted slightly. The stallion's ears were turned to the side and hung a little. "At least one of us is taking it easy," the wanderer grumbled and walked deeper into the clearing. The birds were chirping. Everything seemed normal, if it weren't for the extinguished fire pit at his feet. He bent down on one knee, took off his right glove, and ran his finger through the ashes. It was still warm. "Is this a trap?" he thought to himself. He didn't want to startle, although he was plagued by the feeling that there seemed to be a dozen enemies standing at the edge of the clearing, just waiting to charge at him with their weapons. But if there were really that many, they would certainly have rushed him by now. So he continued to pretend to feel the ashes, but let his gaze wander to the left and right. Just then he heard Asar's rising whinny. Instinctively he rolled to the side and heard something whistling as it sped past him. Back on his feet, he just saw that it was an arrow, which was already stuck in the bark of a tree with a resounding pfft. When a short sword swung in from the side, he jerked around, had put his right hand on the hilt of his sword and pulled it a little way, up to the level of his chest. Just in time. With a clang, the enemy's sword struck the edge of his blade. There he held it, and caught a glimpse of his attacker. "A child?" With a yelp, it had heaved all its body strength into the weapon. Enough that it staggered the wanderer and he had to take a step to the side. With a leap backwards he escaped a horizontal cut along his belly. Clanging, the swords clashed. Again and again the child struck, but the black-armored man opposite him knew how to fend off the steel. With force, he now knocked the child's sword aside, so that he did not lose the weapon from his hand, but his arm was now stretched too far from him to cover himself. The wanderer heaved his knee against the child's chest, After that he tumbled backwards and hit a tree, snorting. Not a second later he had the edge of his sword against his throat. "Why does one like you attack one like me?" the Wanderer demanded to know from the boy. He had to be just 13 or 14 years old. "I won't tell you anything!" the child replied defiantly. Before he could ask another question, he only saw the boy pulling on a rope. Something clicked in the distance and briefly he saw a bolt shoot towards him from the side. With a leap, he pushed himself off the boy so that the projectile missed him and rolled backwards. No sooner had he done so than the lad had darted back to him and struck again with the sword. "Stop that!" the Wanderer demanded, but the child did not listen. Deftly, he now let the child's sword circle around his and guided it so that it slid just past his shoulder. Just after that, he turned his sword in his hand so that he now had the pommel in front and slammed it against the boy's shoulder. The boy yelped in pain, stumbled backwards, and fell on his backside. But before the Wanderer could get at him, the lad once more had a rope in his hand. This time there were several clicks that he heard. Bolts shot towards him. He was able to wall under one, but the next three he had to fight off with the sword. It was only shortly afterwards, however, that he realized that the second had caught him at the shoulder, a grazing shot. Now the Wanderer growled. The brat had come at him again. 3 or 4 times he fended off the attacks. Then the opponent's sword struck his left with the blade. At first the boy looked confident of victory, but the man in front of him did not even bat an eyelid. He must be in terrible pain after all. Instead, he clenched his left hand into a fist and moved it to the left. With the burst, the edge of his sword was broken. Before he could even guess how such a thing was possible, he groaned in pain. The Wanderer kicked his foot against his chest so that he fell backwards again, straight towards another tree trunk. By now his arm, back and chest were aching, and before he could rise, something landed in the wood, close to his face with a mighty whoosh. It was the man's short sword. He had thrown it at him and fortunately missed. But when all at once he saw him in front of him, long sword drawn and held point first against his throat, he was not so sure that he had really missed unintentionally. "Go on," he said resignedly. "Just kill me. You bounty hunters are all the same." "Bounty hunters?" the Wanderer asked himself in thought, weighing his head. The boy did not even look him in the face. He had lowered his head. But now he flinched. The man in front of him had put away the long sword and pulled the short sword out of the bark. "Why do you just attack me like that?" he demanded to know from the boy. "Weapons are not toys. Someone like you should not possess such things." "It is you," the child stated in amazement. Now it had caught sight of the scar over his left eye. "No wonder you could even fend off the bolts like that. You are the Black Wolf. From you I got the trick with the crossbows, the trap." "Why do you just attack me like that?" His voice was now clearly more demanding again. "Do you want to die?" "It's significantly better than surrendering to those bounty hunters. They're all just working for the consecrated blade." Now the man also put the short sword back into its sheath. "You called me a bounty hunter earlier. I suppose I was not the first, if I were one." The boy straightened up. He swayed a little as he did so, however, and held his injured shoulder with one arm. Then he clenched his right hand into a fist and said, "I killed all the others. They all burned their fingers on me. They bit off too much, more than they could chew. That's what I get." "Impossible." The thought echoed in the Wanderer's head. Still, his gaze briefly reached over his shoulder to the extinguished fireplace. He had lured him here on purpose. Unaware of who was coming, but he had expected it to be a bounty hunter. He knew he was being followed. This was a trap, or at least it was supposed to be. "You really killed them?" "Are you going to give me shit about Thorin now?" The man pointed his index finger at him. "You should work on your mouth, kid." "Don't call me kid. I might just be a single head shorter, that's all." "I could have killed you, you fool!" The loud words echoed in the clearing. Even Massar raised his head and looked briefly in their direction before continuing to graze again. The boy bowed his head. Was he sniffling now? "Maybe that would have been better," he muttered to himself. The Wanderer hissed and turned away. The child saw the man just about to take the reins off his horse and start walking, when he shouted, "What about my sword?" The man paused and looked over his shoulder. "Excuse me?" The question sounded like the harbinger of trouble. Nevertheless, the boy trudged a step forward and repeated his question with more vigor. "My sword! You broke it after all! You have two! Give me one!" "Go home, you wretch!" He shouted at him and mounted Assar. "I have no home! Nothing but the old hunter's cottage near here at least. I'll just go with you.
Stop getting on my nerves. Get lost to your parents.
Just as he was about to leave, he heard the boy say, I have parents, mother, but... He didn't feel like turning around again and asked, just like that.
What?
They would only torture me again. At that moment, he wasn't sure if it was the words or the tone in which the boy spoke them, but something prickled in the wanderer's chest at that. With a slight jerk from his wrists and a double cheer-up, he motioned Azar to step.
Try to keep up then,
the boy heard the man say and looked up in response, excited. It picked up half its sword and caught up. They sat together by the fire in the evening. Over the crackling of the flames, the wanderer finally asked,
Do you have a name?
The child just shook its head. None that I want to remember. He looked up at him. How about you? At that the man smiled wearily.
It's much the same with me.
The wanderer had been hearing the boy's stomach growl for a while, but the latter did not say a word.
Are you hungry?
He finally asked him. Crickets chirped.
Do you want something to eat?
And what if I do? What do I have to do for it?
Catch it.
What? Already the wanderer had pulled a piece of dried meat from behind his harness and tossed it to him. The boy had not only caught it. As soon as it was in his hands, he went for it like a ravenous animal. Again the wanderer felt the pain in his chest.
I'll tell you what you actually can do for it.
Too late, the boy replied, hastily continuing to chew.
Stop gulping it down like that. You need to enjoy this. Chew on it for a while. Savor it.
At that the boy actually paused. He eyed the man in front of him like a person one thinks incredibly stupid, but is polite about it and for that very reason tries very hard to hold back all the words that build up in their throat, so that they don't slip from the tongue over their lips. Instead, he swallowed, and with the next bite he simply tried what was suggested to him. That only lasted a few seconds though, and he was already devouring the rest of the meal.
Well, if it's too late, how about you tell me anyway how a fellow like you comes to a bounty?
You'd like to know that, wouldn't you? Collect yourself the sum. The wanderer leaned against a rock and folded his arms behind his head.
I'm not interested in your bounty,
he said, then stuck a blade of grass between his teeth. Of course you're not.
Don't be so defiant. What would I have of the money if I surrendered myself to the consecrated blade?
The boy looked at him thoughtfully.
You have recognized me, haven't you, as the Black Wolf?
The child nodded.
Then you must know that I am wanted myself.
How much is on your head?
1,000 Estonians.
The 1,000? The boy almost choked on the last bite, and right now one could almost read the pictures from his face of what he could do with it. If I kill you, I'm sure they'll waive my bounty and I can still make quite a lot from the rest.
Ha!
What's so funny about that?
I know you won't do that.
Oh yeah? The wanderer nodded. And from where?
You are just craving company. But you have nothing but your own honor and decency to keep you from becoming a savage. Well, it is a constant struggle, all right, but apparently you have not quite lost it yet.
And what about you?
What about me?
You obviously talk about you as you used to be. How is it today? He remained silent as he saw the man put his finger to his lips. The Black Wolf rose in a steady, slow movement, gradually placing his hand on the hilt of the longsword.